Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time long before smartphones, streaming, or even reliable plumbing. Settle in, dim the lights, maybe wrap up in a blanket if you like. I'll tell you some medieval tales, the sort of stories people whispered in taverns, or around hearths, that sounded fanciful, and then, surprisingly, turned out to be true. I'll go slowly. There's no rush. We'll meander through legends of ghosts, giants, miracles, weird royal curses, and odd artifacts. Some are grotesque. Mostly they're strange. And yes, some even darker than you might expect. But I promise, nothing too horrible. Just enough to intrigue, make you wonder, maybe drift off thinking about how what history really is. There was once talk of corpse candles, eerie floating lights said to appear before someone of importance died. They glowed near rooftops, hovered over doorways, then faded. Parish records from Norfolk in the 1500s mentioned these lights again and again, almost like clockwork, in the days before deaths. Maybe it was gas, maybe lanterns in the fog, maybe just nerves. But the pattern was there. The myth, so often dismissed, rested on real sightings, faithfully recorded. And then there were the priests who decided to mock their superiors. The Feast of Fools, they called it. Choir boys dressed as bishops, deacons playing kings, drunken sermons, songs full of questionable theology. It sounds like something exaggerated, but church letters from the 1400s confirmed the chaos. The clergy themselves complained of it, of course. They always do, after the fact. In times of plague, people swore blood fell from the sky. Red rain, red dew, staining fields. Chronicles from the Black Death mention it often. Droplets that tasted like wine. Modern science would say algae, spores, or red dust from the Sahara. But back then, it was a warning. A sky bleeding before the earth did. There's an old French tale about a nobleman who couldn't be cut by steel. Swords would glance off, blows would leave no wound. It sounds absurd, but the chronicles name him Sir Guillaume de Louis. He believed he was protected by a relic sewn into his armor. Maybe it was superstition. Maybe the armor was just very good. Either way, he survived things he shouldn't have. That's how legends grow. Not from nothing, but from improbable luck. People also whispered that certain churches could feel pain. When kings died, the walls would groan, the beams would moan, the crucifixes might even bleed. Abbey of St. Denis, for instance. Chroniclers noted that when Henry II died, the bells rang on their own. These days would say expansion, humidity, bad masonry. But to the monks, it was grief and stone. Poisoned gloves made for a fine cautionary tale, especially in royal courts where gifts could be as deadly as insults. The story goes that a queen received gloves laced with poison and wore them proudly to her own slow demise. Silly, right? Except it wasn't entirely fiction. Letters from Marguerite de Valois mention her fear of poisoned clothing. Another case in Poland ended with real deaths and whispered autopsies. A soft touch, a fashionable gesture, fatal. Hidden caves full of treasure, guarded by snakes. It's the sort of thing parents told to keep children from wandering into danger. Yet in 12th century Armenia, monks stored relics in a mountain cave crawling with vipers. They had to block the entrance with chains. Treasure and snakes, indeed. Truth, just less glamorous than the fairy tale. Then there's the queen who played music to drown her grief. It sounds poetic, almost too much so. But Margaret of Scotland did just that. She would play the lute late into the night after her daughter's death. Isabella of Castile, too, filled her chambers with music after losing a child. Legends tend to exaggerate, but sometimes they only exaggerate slightly. A stranger one, royal twins who thought they were unrelated. In 13th century France, One twin was raised at court, the other fostered out and assumed dead. Decades later, paperwork unearthed the truth. Imagine meeting the brother you never knew. Already an adult, already half a stranger. The legend of separated twins is a fairy tale, but the court records make it history. There's also the nobleman who married his niece. It sounds like moral propaganda, but in the Habsburg and Portuguese courts it happened regularly. Duke Alfonso of Portugal did so and regretted it publicly, writing of deformities among their children, of guilt and divine punishment. When morality tales mirror the genealogies, you start to understand where the sermons came from. Somewhere in the Vatican archives lies a letter from Pope Leo III, describing a strange creature seen in Friesland. Limbs of a man, head of a beast, he wrote, and ordered it drawn. The sketch vanished, but the letter survived. So yes, even popes joined in the medieval fascination with monsters, not entirely myth, but clerical curiosity at its most human. The witch trials are grim enough, but there's a darker footnote. Before burning women, some courts tried their cats first. In 15th century Innsbruck, legal records described the cat of the witch, accused of carrying his spells. They put it on trial. It did not end well for the cat. The absurdity would be funny if it weren't so horribly sincere. You've heard of kings who never quite died, the ones who ride off into legend. King Olaf of Norway, for example, his body was never found, so people kept seeing him in fishing villages. Decades later, England had the same with King John. Letters had to be sent to confirm, repeatedly, that he was still very much dead. The boundary between mourning and hope is a thin one. Prophets who couldn't see were often believed to see more than anyone else. A blind woman in Palermo, Lucia, predicted disaster in 1348. No one listened, and when the plague arrived, she was suddenly famous. In Russia, a blind monk correctly foresaw the path of a Mongol raid. Maybe coincidence, maybe rumor. Either way, the blind saw what the sighted didn't. And finally, the legend of the miraculous child, a prince whose touch healed, or who spoke like a saint. Hagiographers loved those stories, but a few were true enough. St. Louis IX, long before sainthood, fasted and prayed with startling devotion as a child. Monks wrote of it, sincerely if not skeptically. The line between miracle and overachievement is blurry. So there you have them. 15 medieval legends, each absurd, each somehow real. Real enough to leave ink on parchment. Real enough to keep retold for centuries. As you drift now, maybe you notice a pattern. The Middle Ages weren't a time of ignorance. Not really. They were a time when the world felt personal, where rain, or echoes, our luck might mean something. When faith filled the gaps in explanation, and stories filled the gaps in faith. Let's stay here for a moment, in the half-light between myth and record. The fire's gone low. The wind outside the castle wall hums softly. You can almost hear the stones breathe. When you're ready, we'll drift on to the next set of tales. Part 2 will be waiting.